something we don't see but once a year. It's our friend. Sometimes we don't get to see them over the year. It's been so rewarding over the years, different topics, and how much has been learned by all of us. That we're in this, I said, the third decade of this process. After today, every speaker that will be coming for the rest of the week will also be here at the panel in the afternoon. Our speakers have to get back to Maine, but starting as of tomorrow, after their speech in the morning, they will be here to participate with the panel, and that's also a very fun part of that process. And we thank you for coming. We have a moderator each day and a real gifted panel, and after they give their presentations, then you'll become involved in the discussion. And I just wanted to make that announcement again and introduce my friend, Judy Watley, who has been very gracious to agree to be the first moderator on the first day. She is an extraordinary person and extremely bright and very active in the community, and I'm delighted that Judy was able to do this tonight. We'll turn the program over to Judy Watley. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. The first thing we need to know is how to work these microphones. Just push the button, right? We do have a great panel with us today, and let me take an opportunity to introduce them. We have Jim McLeod, who is the NIC Department of English instructor down at the Inn. Dr. Rodney Fry, Director of the North Idaho Programs for the Lewis and Clark State College. Jeannie Gibbons from the Coeur d'Alene Tribe. John Odell, Vice President, the NIC Chapter of Phi Theta Kappa. And Erna Reinhardt, the NIC Department of College Relations. And Robert Singletary, the NIC History Department. And we tried to sit in the order that we're listed in case you have questions that you want to direct to any specific panel member. It'll make it a little easier. I hope most of you were able to attend this morning and listen to Dr. Loren Coleman talk about the phenomena of mysterious places and events in the United States. I had no idea that there were so many different events, mysterious events and mysterious places. He talked about Mystery Hill, the Petroglyphs, Fort Mountain, built by small white people. That's a legend of the local Cherokee Indians. The Seven Devils Canyon, and cattle mutilation, Kelly Creature, Thunderbird, Mothman, Black Mountain Lions. And that was just a few of the many phenomena that he talked about. But some of the even more interesting things was one of the quotes by Charles Ford that says, "One measures a circle beginning anywhere." And I think today on this panel, that's one of the things we'll be focusing on. Also, the fact that we've lost sight of hidden meanings of words in folklore, the names of places, and we discover that even after we rename them, the same phenomena is happening there, and they end up with our Western names. I think those are some of the things that the panel will want to be talking about today, and I'd like to give them each an opportunity to give a response to what they heard this morning, and we'll just go right down, starting with Jim McLeod.
Okay, what I heard this morning. Well, I heard a number of things, and maybe some things I wish I had heard, I didn't hear, but I guess the couple of things that came to mind as I listened to Loren this morning that I thought were important, that I think he underscored fairly well, but I'd like to just try as well to underscore them too, and that's that I think that you don't have to believe in a lot of these things necessarily to investigate them, and I think it's important to remember that. Too often people assume that because you look into something that you're necessarily a believer in it, and I think that was a significant point that he made. And the other one that comes to mind that I think we need to really keep with us this week is that we need to keep our sense of humor about some of these things. And I think that business about the trailer, for those of you who were there, was a classic example of it.
I was very appreciative of Dr. Coleman, sorry, his presentation, because it seemed to anchor what can be very elusive material phenomena in a meaningful way. He was very sincere, and it certainly will lead to lots of discussion, I'm sure, all week long, and got me thinking about things that I had not thought about for some time. And even our lunch conversation was beaming with all sorts of ripe examples of what can be and what is mysterious. I guess one of the questions that I had throughout it was the question, where does the mystery reside? Where does it reside? What is the mysterious? Where is it? In a place? In an event? Or perhaps someplace else? One thing that I was kind of intrigued with was reference to some Native American materials, certainly mysterious to us, perhaps as not being of that cultural tradition, but I'm wondering how mysterious they really are to those who partake of the petroglyphs or the rocks, the arrangement of those. Let me return back to that a little later on, but I was real intrigued with anchoring the phenomenon of the mysterious. Where, in fact, does it exist? Does it exist out there? Or maybe it's a little closer to home.
I was very struck by Dr. Coleman's presentation. I appreciated that he stuck to the facts and what he has researched. He finds this very interesting, obviously, but he manages to maintain a sense of humor as well. I'd like to share with you something I heard as I just sat down, and just as the speaker, Dr. Coleman, began. A young student came to her teacher and said, "Do I really have to sit here and listen to this because this really bothers me because of my religion?" And the teacher said, "Keep an open mind if you want to. If you want to leave, that's your prerogative too." I had just suggested this might be something you could work on for a paper. So the student did leave. And I found that very, very interesting in light of how Dr. Coleman had presented his information, which is, here's something worth kicking around, talking about. It's not going to hurt. And I thought that was really interesting to present to this crowd of overwhelmingly young people in the audience. So anyway, I'm here to share a few thoughts with you about things later on in the discussion.
I guess I'm here to represent the younger people in the crowd. Yeah, it was majority young students there, and it was interesting to hear Dr. Coleman's views. I basically really liked the way he presented it, how he did his research. It was really in depth, and it was really interesting the way, the interesting ways he went about it and how he researched all his books and stuff. I don't know, I feel nowadays most people, they have a very closed mind. They believe what they want to believe, and then they just, shut off all other outside things. And I think in our society today, to answer some of these mysterious questions, we have to have an open mind, just to get to the bottom of some of these things. I feel that we should never stop looking for the answers and never stop asking questions. Thank you.
I'll have to be one of the first to admit that when I walked into the auditorium today, I was a little bit skeptical, and I listened to what Dr. Coleman said with an open mind, and I really appreciate the manner in which he gave his presentation. I was very impressed with how he really conveyed all of his information, and that he really works hard to go to the direct source of the sighting. I think that's very important because, as we all know, as stories get told and they go down the line, lots of times the factual information is what gets left out. I was very, very intrigued with these thunderbirds. I was out at Tubbs Hill yesterday with my 5-year-old, and we were sitting out on the point of the rocks and watching the seagulls fly. And I asked my son Riley, I said, wouldn't it be nice to fly? And then when Dr. Coleman shared the story about the thunderbirds, I said, well, maybe they're still away. Anyway, here's Mr. Singletary.
Thank you. This also brought back some memories for me this morning that I had not thought of since following Jim's train of thought there since childhood. And I talked to Loren a little bit later. He was on the way to catch a plane, and I intend to write him later and tell them my experience. And I'll start with this just briefly because I could very possibly be written up in this book, because as a child, about 8 or 9 years old, I lived in the edge of the Okefenokee Swamp in South Georgia, where I grew up. And mysterious places and mysterious animals and stories. I came from a very rich storytelling tradition, and had heard stories about our dogs going into the woods and coming back. They would tree something and would come back with their tails underneath and frightened with something and would not go any further. And this was stories I had heard since an early child. But I happened to experience one moonlight night. Our house, the old houses in the south, the kitchen were built separate from the main part of the house. And one night I heard the cats going crazy, which was not unusual. They often fought with each other. So I had to go get a drink of water. That didn't frighten me. It was night. I'd been out the night before. But as I moved into the back of the kitchen, the light was shining through the window, and this huge, monstrous, the window was up at least 5 to 6 feet. I could see the paws and the face right in the window, and saw as it moved down and it got back from the window, moved out into the moonlight, I could see the tail. So there was my Black Panther. And these stories had been going around for years. And I experienced that as a child. Well, as I grew up and became educated in the ways of science and modern technology, those things that I grew up as a child sort of became, again, myths and legends and stories. But the way I look at it today, I truly think that we should have an open mind, going back to what Jim stated, that we, for certainly since the Renaissance times, have lived in a very objective, science-oriented, measurable, deterministic kind of orientation. And I think maybe there is such a thing as a kind of reality that is beyond that we may cannot measure. And I certainly think we should leave an open mind that that is something we can pursue. And I'm certainly glad to see that imagination is still with us.
When I thought about what Dr. Coleman's presentation would be like, and then when I witnessed it today, it was a little different than what I expected. As I began thinking about any kind of thing as a panel member that I could share with you in terms of mysterious places, sacred places, there are a couple of things that come to mind. This area in particular, as Jim will tell us, is very rich in special sacred places. One area that is very special to Native Americans, the people who have lived here for hundreds and hundreds of years, are the waterfalls, the falls at Post Falls and the falls at Spokane Falls. And out of these very sacred places, you look at them, they're very different, they touch you in a certain way. The falls at Spokane Falls, there is a Spokane legend about the coyote who wanted to marry into the tribe, and the Coeur d'Alene tribal chief said, no, you cannot, and he became angry and he threw the 3 discs of the sun into the waterfalls, causing those waterfalls at Spokane Falls to be some of the brightest, most iridescent, shimmering kind of waterfalls. Waterfalls are sacred, at least within the tribes of this region. At Post Falls, there is a legend of a young member of a band of Hayden's band at Hayden Lake who was out fishing, and he was throwing a teepee pole, a long pole, into the lake, and he was at a whirlpool area. He was sucked down into that whirlpool at the southern part of Hayden Lake, and he had a 3-day journey underground, and he disappeared, and everyone was worried about him. He saw a light, and he resurfaced at Post Falls, and he believes that is where he met his creator, and he prayed very hard. And again, I think all of these places are very sacred, and there's a reason why a lot of us are attracted to this area. That's why we chose this to be our home. Just another little example. American Indian people hold burial sites to be very, very sacred. This is where we bury our dead. We honor them every year. We clean the graves. And do you recall about 10 years ago some bones were discovered at the construction site, which is now the old Osprey restaurant? Do you recall? Well, I recall, and the tribal chairman at that time said, due to federal legislation, we could probably have this construction halted, and it's called the Antiquities Act. And that was not done, but the bones, what they found of the bones, were given to the Coeur d'Alene tribe. And apparently all of those bones have not been recovered. There was not a complete set of any human. There were pieces and fragments, but the tribe's contention is probably that there are still more remains there at the area that is the marina, the offices, the restaurant. And it just occurred to me that that place, the developer went bankrupt, the restaurant went bankrupt, that marina is sink or swim. I think that, you could put, but there are people who do not regard burial sites as very sacred. And throughout this entire area, there were 33 bands of Indians living on and around the St. Joe River, the Coeur d'Alene River, and all around Lake Coeur d'Alene. This area here is the very spot that the largest band lived. So this is a real special place, and I think that as I thought of what this discussion would be, is that we would be talking about mysterious places. And this is a mysterious place, but it's a special place. It's not frightening, it's just a real good, peaceful place to be.
I know that members of the audience have questions, but before we get to that, Jim, you've done some research on some, well, we don't want to say lake monsters, do we? Lake sightings, or sightings of strange creatures in the lakes. Can you tell us about those?
Well, as I said this morning, I was born and raised in this area. Basically, I can remember coming up here to Captain Finney's dock when I was 8 or 9 years old, and being able to look 20, 30 feet down at Lake Coeur d'Alene, and it was very clear and beautiful water, and you can't do that now, despite the fact the boardwalk's probably a little nicer facility. But I would have thought, as a child, I would have heard some of these stories about Coeur d'Alene Lake or Lake Pend Oreille, and I didn't, and I was quite surprised when I picked up Loren Coleman's book and learned that we were supposedly the home of some of these lake monsters. So I got interested in this whole business, and I did discover, this is probably new information, it was to me, maybe to some of you, perhaps some of you are old enough you remember this, but well, I doubt it. 1890s, there was a seal in Lake Coeur d'Alene whose name was Dick. And this seal apparently decided to take a journey around Lake Coeur d'Alene Lake some years ago and went down to Harrison and Chatcolet, and some people down there saw it in the water and they thought it was a monster, so it got into the press somehow, and first thing you know, it was all over the country that Lake Coeur d'Alene had a monster, and so that's how the Lake Coeur d'Alene monster story began. I got that out of Backward Glances, for those of you who remember that column in the paper in the 1950s around here. Lake Pend Oreille is a little different situation. And I should say this too, this is a very complicated issue, and I don't want to just go on and on about it, but just to acknowledge what Jeannie said about the Native American peoples in this area. They did have some stories about things in the lakes that were sometimes referred to as a buffalo in the lake, and I can remember one in particular about Coeur d'Alene Lake where one of the canoes was out here in the head of the Spokane River and was hung up on something, and one of the Coeur d'Alenes thought that the lake spirit had the canoe, and so he promised to do something or threw a fish over the side or something of that nature, and the water buffalo let water buffalo here in the sense of not in the sense of a Southeast Asian animal, but in the sense of an actual animal in the water, let the canoe go. So there's all sorts of legends and traditions about this. If you'd like to read about them, Ella Clark and her Indian Legends of the Northern Rockies, or Indian Legends of the Pacific Northwest, has a lot of accounts about that. Lake Pend Oreille is a whole different story, and I really have gone on at some length there. I think I'm going to shut up and just wait. If someone wants to ask me about that in detail, I'll tell you more about that later.
I'd like to just, Jeannie made a couple of words that I found interesting, and she mentioned special places and mysterious places. And I'm wondering if somehow over time special places don't become mysterious places. Is that they really start out as special, not necessarily mysterious. maybe you could make some comments about what do you mean by special and then what do you mean by mysterious.
Being raised in the Coeur d'Alene tribal belief system has its pluses and minuses because for one, you're blessed being raised with a lot of respect for animal spirits and respect for the cycles of life and the seasons and the children and the elders and respect for tradition. But the disadvantage is that predominantly the world is, or at least the United States, is very Anglo-Saxon. So something that is special becomes so totally mysterious once you put it into the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant context. The explaining that you have to do rather than the actual just acceptance of animal spirits, the acceptance of mysteries, the acceptance of the power of medicine, that kind of explaining over and over again, then things become mysterious. Did I answer that? Thank you.
Well, I guess now's the time to take questions from the audience. Okay, while you all are thinking of some questions.
I have one, Judy.
Okay.
I think Loren Coleman really just initiates a lot of thinking, and I think that that was really testified to with John a moment ago. And we did a TV show with him earlier, so we got some other information. But I was really intrigued by his comment about where we're at today, and I think Jeannie was referring to this some too, is we become so technical. And when Buckminster Fuller was here, I remember him saying that so vividly and articulating such eloquence. He said we have just had tremendous advancement in technology on this planet, but that we really have done little to advance from a human hearing viewpoint. He's really quite critical. And so that technology we've created can result in the destruction of our planet if we don't do the same kind of advancement in human relations that we've done. And I just thought I heard that in Coleman's statement this morning, and that in tying it to this subject, that seemed that he was saying that, and Robert, you were telling us this too, that we're just laying aside some things, and maybe we are losing something by doing that. And he said to us on television that it was really resulting in that people were intrigued with violence, not because they've laid some other things aside. I just like to get the panel's reaction to, I think where Coleman was going with that comment.
You want to start with that, Jim?
I think I'm going to pass.
Well, I don't know, maybe I'm picking up on a statement I had made earlier. I do think then, and Rodney and I had gotten some conversations in some of my classes before about, there seems to be, with the things that we appear, what we would call mysterious today, going back in primal times and even back into medieval times, would they be mysterious to people then? Mystery was, it seemed like things that did not have an answer was part of life. We didn't view it as something extraordinary, that it was part of the life cycle, that mysterious things were part of being. And that there's something about, to me, about something very live and tangible even. We're so used, it seems to me, that science, we're so oriented that we go to science for every single thing. We've even, in the years of the Enlightenment, we even looked at religion actually in scientific views as the deism. We looked at that things had a deterministic, everything was set and that's the way it was. It was very clear, determined, measurable. And I think the concept of mystery are things that go into what I call a kind of another reality. I guess you want to call it subjective reality. And I think ancient peoples had this, and it was not extraordinary. I think it was quite ordinary. And I think today we make it appear to be mysterious and out of the ordinary because we're so used to measurable information and determined information.
Erna, do you have a response?
Pass.
John?
What exactly were you asking?
John, you sparked part too. You were talking about having an open mind. And I think that's what, sometimes people who are so bright, I have difficulty knowing exactly what they're trying to tell me. There's some abstractness. And what I'm saying, John, I was just sitting there thinking, I was doing connecting, which I believe is very important. And I think what Mr. Fuller and Coleman were both trying to connect on the same point, and that is that there is, or at least I heard this, that there's two paths on this planet. And one of them is human beings, how they develop their own human spirit and their relationship with others. And number two, while we're doing that, how we develop the technology that we have. And I just thought I heard both of those men who I think were extremely bright, saying that we had done such a good job with the technology, but when we understand it, and scientists help us explain how a computer works, etc., or how many of us are trained to deal with research and majoring scientifically, even in political science field. But that because we spent our time there, I thought Coleman was saying that in relation, and something that Jeannie's talked about, that we laid some things aside that because they don't fit this technology, don't fit this structure of measurement, and that may be causing trouble in that second component of our lives.
Yeah, when you're attending college, over the years, people tend to seem like they just want to get by. They want to get through college. They want to do what the teachers want. They don't want to, open their mind and learn what's going on out there in the world today and other parts of the country. And I feel people now just kind of want to get through college and get the technical aspect through, and so they can make money. They want to get their business degrees and go out in the world and make $1 million by the time they're 22. It seems like, and I think everybody's just kind of losing track of people and how people feel. I myself, when I was younger, my big aspiration was to go into business and make $1 million and stuff like that. But as I started attending college, I changed to an education major. I want to go into the high schools and try and make a difference and open people's minds to not just technology, but to some of the other things that are going on in our world today.
I'd just like to play off that a little bit and say that one of the things that I think is happening to some degree is the loss of curiosity on the part of many students. And I know my son, who's 22 years old, came into me yesterday and he said that he'd been down at the Forest Service office, and he said that he'd picked up a pamphlet or some information about walks and hikes in this area you could take, and there was something like 19 or 20 different ones you could do. And he said, I've lived here, well, he was actually born here, and all my life, and he said, I didn't know that there were all these places you could go hike and walk. And I thought, this is wonderful, he's finding this out, but what an incredible bit of business. Here he's 22 years old and he doesn't know this, and I think he's a fairly intelligent person who's quite active and has played sports and that sort of thing, and you'd think he would know that. But I think there are a lot of people in our community that do not appreciate the kinds of things that are here, that do not have a very good sense of the history of this area, a good sense of what things there are to inquire about. And I think that's something that I would like to see more of. So it's not so much to me that we have these great, huge mysteries or something. There are little mysteries in our own community here that we could look into that would give us something important to hang on to.
If I could follow it up just a little bit too, with the discussion that's been going on. As I alluded to initially, I want to explore also, it seems to me, the placing of the mysterious, the special, the mysterious, the paradigms that we have as social scientists coming out of the tradition there. In 1974, I had just finished up my master's degree in anthropology and was ripe with the tools of social science. I had my Levi-Strauss structuralism down pat. My functionalism was unprecedented, and I was launched then into a mystery. I was taken from urban, white American class with this tradition, with these tools to unravel the mysterious and placed on the Crow Indian Reservation for the next 6 years. I didn't know at that time it would be for the next 6 years, but with these tools helping to unravel what for many people, white Anglo-Saxon people, were mysteries. The tools themselves were predicated on what Robert alluded to, a lot of objectification, a lot of quantification, Levi-Straussian structuralism, not to go into any details, is a very useful model, a very useful tool for unraveling a lot of the mysteries dealing with thinkings of traditional peoples, particularly expressed in mythologies. It has countered lots of prejudices. It has countered, attacked lots of stereotypes. It's been very useful. But it is a tool, and it has its limitations. And with these tools, I began experiencing the reality of these folks that had a different set of assumptions than myself. And I realized very quickly that these tools, while useful, were not complete in and of themselves. And I needed something else. And I liked the words of Dr. Coleman when he was talking about, I think the quote was, these are real people with real experiences. Let's respect them. To some extent, I think that we have to validate and look for the experience in and of itself, and not simply gloss over the experience with lots of interpretation that may miss the specialness or the sacredness or the mystery of it. For example, with regard to the crow, one of the phenomena, one of the experiences, one of the mysteries that I had to contend with very early on were the awakuri, the little people. Now, there was lots of stories of little people. They were relatively commonplace among the crow. It was a mystery to me, little people, little colonies. They do the same sorts of things that you and I do. They live up there, and the crows would tell me where they live. And I would then categorize them using my good Levi-Straussian structuralism as a type of mythology. I had my tools that I could account for and take some of the mystery away. And that was fine up to the point until I experienced firsthand one of the little people. This is not supposed to happen. There it was. It was before me, this event. And I had all that structuralism, all that social science went out the window when I had to deal with it on an experiential basis. And then I started going to the crows then for their understanding and their explanation. Not to explain it away, not to take the specialness and the mystery out of it to a certain extent, but to grant it for what it is and accept it for what it is in terms of the people themselves, how they understood it. And that was, for me, a big step. I had to take away some of the baggage that I was carrying into, open it up. And I heard Loren Coleman talking a lot about having an open mind, not closing it off. And that was, I think, very important for us to do. Always keep that open mind and to be aware of what we're bringing into the explanation.
Don't you think you ought to be more specific about that little experience you had?
Yeah, I had a question. A long time ago I saw a movie, and they had found some Indian, they'd gotten some sort of Indian thing, and they saw pictures of flying saucers and stuff drawn on the walls. And I wonder, 200 years ago, if we told people that we got light from hydroelectric power, so we got light from water, they wouldn't understand it, they couldn't comprehend it. And I wonder if maybe other civilizations have had power, that they've mastered flight, and the Aztecs had brain surgery and stuff. And I wonder if they had some sort of power that we just can't fathom because, the way we've been used to it. And I just wondered if anybody had heard anything on that.
That's a really good point. From the predominant culture's viewpoint, a lot of things just don't make sense. Remember, Dr. Coleman today asked the question, do things have to be explained away? I believe, Indian people have started using a saying, which is, it's used by many tribes in the Northwest, but the saying is, walk in beauty. Walk in beauty. And what that really means is that people who live their lives as an individual, like a triangle, the 3 points being the emotional, the physical, and the spiritual, will walk in beauty, and they will have this kind of understanding, this kind of acceptance and a healthy life, free of anxiety. Now, there are other kinds of people in the world who have only 2 points, and that would be the emotional and the physical, without the spiritual, and not being able to understand, like Rodney explains his experience as he first encounters the little people of the crow people. He needed to have that scientific explanation, that real one-dimensional kind of thinking that it's not Rodney's fault. He was brought up that way. It's how this country runs, really. It's very one-dimensional. Just watch the presidential campaign. You can see A follows B, follows C. It's very linear. But this triangle, the 3 points of allowing you as an individual to possess that, for lack of a better word, that intuition, giving some credit to that extra part of you that has a little bit of extra sense to it, that can feel things, anticipate things, and understand things without having to explain things away.
It's really interesting. The question was asked to explain a little bit more about the little people. And in fact, it was in a spiritual context that I first experienced the little people. It had to be during a fast, in a context that involved another reason not to experience the fast, but had to do with my son. And with the assistance of one of the elders, led on this fast for 3 days without food and water. But it was during that experience that the little people did come. And I had my first-hand experience with it in that context, subsequent to other experiences. But it had to do with opening up that side of me that, with social sciences, again, not to belittle the extreme usefulness of that perspective, because it has challenged many, many stereotypes and prejudices, but it is one package of many packages that we need to consider. And it was that opening up that, for me, in that growing experience, parts of myself that then I could experience it in this more fuller, 3-point way, as Jeannie mentioned.
Were these little people facilitators in nature? Were they like at Finhorn?
They're just about this tall.
I mean, in the Finhorn, where they were using, all right, were these little people the same as what they were using?
I'm not familiar enough with the Finhorn people. These are folks that come usually in times of sometimes they're unbeknownst. They show up when you least expect them. Sometimes it's time of stress, but I don't want to reduce it simply to some sort of psychological need on my part.
I am not.
Yeah.
I am strictly speaking
Yeah.
in the spirit world.
Mm-hmm.
We have our world and the spirit world, and they live together.
Absolutely. That would be a good articulation. Yes.
Yes, I'd like to ask you the panel's comment on Carlos Castaneda's presentation of spirituality and mystery and peaceful.
As an anthropologist in training, a couple responses. I think truth exists at many different levels. There's an ethnographic truth that I would be very concerned about, and many anthropologists are very concerned about the accurateness ethnographically of Carlos Castaneda's Yaqui materials. Much of that wasn't revealed by other anthropologists who had for years and years and years worked with the Yaqui Indians. On the other hand, if we understand it as not a literal, perhaps, statement of Yaqui spiritualism, but maybe a metaphoric or anagogic level, at the spiritual level, maybe there's truths that can be shared more widely. It's an amazing account, but I like to look at fiction as an amazing account too, that has many, many rewards for us.
Are there other questions from the audience? Yes.
In Dr. Coleman's talk today, he mentioned that most of the things that he was going to talk about was like 80% imagination or people's dreams or whatever, and 20% might be fact. But what amazes me, and this young fellow here that's representing the younger people of the college, he was talking about people are going to have to still get involved in this thinking and looking back, because a lot of the things that he was talking about today, the Bigfoot, the flying saucers, the flying men, you can go way back in the history of Indians had pictures and Aztecs and Mayans had pictures of guys in flight suits or space suits and monsters and everything. Now this can't all be imagination for thousands of years back. There's got to be some factual stuff to this thing. And like the Thunderbird, I was wondering too about Rodney. Does the crow, is there anything similar in the Thunderbird? Because I know I'm part Indian myself, and I've been reading a lot on my own about different things. And you look at different tribes, and they may be thousands of miles apart, yet they have these same carvings or drawings of same type people, same type animals, same type sea monsters or whatever, lake monsters. And this goes way back. So it just blows my mind that 80% of this can be just fiction or imagination or whatever, and maybe 20% truth. And all these people have been recording this through time. There's got to be something to it. And that's just what keeps my mind open all the time to this stuff. I just don't know how you feel about that. You know, how does it, like Dr. Fry, does the crow have anything equal to the Thunderbird or similar, or that the other Indians he was talking about today?
Well, it's a very good question, Bob, and there's a lot of levels that have to be brought into, a lot of explanation, a lot of discussion, a lot of issues. I think as a point of fact, the crow don't have a Thunderbird image per se, but they do have references to big birds, and there's many accounts in their oral literature of big birds that come and can transport individuals.
Okay, now that's what I was getting at. The crow had this, but yet they called it the Thunderbird in this other area where he was talking about. So it's actually similar type birds or flying people or whatever, only they were drawn or interpreted a little bit different by each people. Is that?
Yes. I would, as an anthropologist, would suggest that there's a lot of symbolic meaning here to suggest that this relates to the fact that here we're dealing with folks that are transporting, that are moving, maybe regarding to a vision quest experience, and thus the image, the symbol of the bird itself would be an appropriate imagery to suggest this movement. That doesn't, again, deny the possibility of it existing on a more empirical level, too. But it would certainly, you'd want to bring in all these levels of understanding to account for the meaning as understood by the crow or any other individual.
To them, a bird could have been an airplane, per se, or a rocket ship. And like you go back to some of the, like in Mexico, they have, I believe it is, or Incas or Maya, somebody had drawings of people in spacesuits. And they have the same similar thing of transporting people. So this thing is not all new to us. It goes way back. And these mysterious things.
I'm sorry, Jenny, go ahead.
Just very briefly, let's consider those ancient societies and look at what a large role religion and spirituality played in those societies. There were shamans, medicine men, there were apprentices of those. There was a definite commitment to spirituality. And with all of that prayer, fasting, and visioning, I'm sure that there could be that projection as to what the future would hold, either it be in legend form or actually having a vision as to what the future would be. That, to me, would answer the Aztecs having pictures of spacemen and rocket ships and those kinds of things. If you look at a society that devoted a large part of its time to prayer and to the Creator, you're going to end up with some unique, special kinds of things.
I think, was it Thordal that did the investigation of a lot of symbols in various civilizations? It seems to be, in my understanding, when we think of primal times, times beyond the advent of what we know as scientific objectivity, there were other ways of knowing things, and there are many ways of knowing things. And I think the spiritual world, as we call it spiritual, or we sometimes use the word religion, are sacred. In my understanding of the primal, there was no separation between what we would call material reality and spiritual reality as sacred. There was a holistic kind of view there. And it's only through the advent of science that we've separated those and made them very special things. And I think to me that there was hardly any separation between the sacred. It would be hard to find words, for instance, for religion or words for art. They all seem to be a part of everything, and there was no distinction between those. And I think in the Western world particularly, we, because of our objectivity and our emphasis on rationality, have sort of excluded all those things, and we've made them very special and unusual.
Tony usually gets by with just asking questions, but he asked a question of us that I'm not sure we've actually drawn out fully yet. So I'm going to ask the question of Tony, what he was concerned about. He spoke of the relating a lot of this discussion of the quest for the mysterious to much of the concerns that our youth have today, for example, and seeing a lot of interest in violence. Am I paraphrasing some concerns there? Following up on our discussion thus far, is there something to the effect, as Robert suggested, maybe with this objectification, this quantification that we have in our Western worldview, and as Jeannie suggested, maybe looking at 2 points instead of the 3 points, much of the totality of what it is that can define us as human beings, the spiritual being negated here. Because of that, we find in our own society a quest then among our youth to fill that void, searching for something to fill that void. And so we invent, if we cannot find in a more constructive manner, areas of mystery. And what's being marketed right now, it's probably an extensive discussion here, is a mystery of violence. And is there something like that going on, Tony? Do you imagine?
I feel very awkward in this role. For 28 years, I've asked the questions. With a television show, it's wonderful to ask. It's so much easier to ask than it is to respond. But I would simply say that one of the great fortunate experiences that we all, I think, in North College have had in trying to address your question has been with all these speakers that have come in for 22 years and many others on the television show that don't appear in these lectures. We're about to reach our 1,000th program of simply sharing ideas. And I really sense that Robert have a good answer for this too, because he and I talked a lot of times about, well, I guess we both would suspect might have been the most challenging time in history in the context of how periods are different. That's the Renaissance. And I think one of my suspicions is, and Coleman just triggered it again today, it was not something new for me, is that I think Jeannie is onto something. And that is, I think there are different components to life. And for that life on this planet, I would even go so far as to not be afraid to suggest that it is perfectly fine to theorize that life is not confined to this particular little planet within the universe or universes. And so it seems to me that when people turn to things like violence, and violence is really growing, in particular our society, and people are 8 or 10 years old and killing people, it used to be a very unusual thing. It's unfortunately becoming common. Coleman was saying to us last night, when we were discussing it, he thought that some people reaching out for something, and they were taking some really bizarre ways of doing that. So I guess what I'm suggesting is, and one reason why I think this topic was chosen by our committee as we looked at it, is let us proceed to deal with something that has become, in some aspects, almost taboo. That is, you don't talk about it. And I guess the curiosity in the human being is dampened by so much things going on in our society. I would also address this to the political arena and the courts and be very critical and say that censorship is an extremely dangerous thing. I think that's why this particular topic is healthy, and from both perspectives, that I think we should, as Coleman suggested today, we should be very willing to pursue and question. We should also be willing to listen to James Randi on Friday, too, who will critique it. I'm going in many directions here with my thoughts, but one person said to me that was very excited about the early part of the week. Why would you bring someone to criticize? He's nasty in his criticism. And I said, because I like the First Amendment, that I believe he should be heard also. So I guess what I'm trying to say in a rounding way is that it seems to me, and I'm going back to John, that we are failing in society if we're afraid to inquire. And inquiring in the spiritual or the emotional. Jeannie made me think, I was thinking about it, maybe it's already in this category, but when we talk about the emotional and the physical and the spiritual, and I would say the brain and the intellectual. Maybe it fits in. Maybe it fits in with the human's either the emotional or the spiritual. I almost think it in the fourth dimension. And so anyway, why was Coleman so correct when he said that we're so afraid to go back in history and even pursue this? It's not dangerous to ask the question. And I guess I'll conclude by saying one author, I don't know who it was, said something that was really powerful in the sense that, and someone asked the question, why? And his response was, why not?
Yes.
I have just a comment, something in listening to the conversation today and past experiences. To me, what underlies a lot of the problems in dealing with this issue, doesn't matter what side of the fence you're on, is the issue of power. And society today bases their power on different aspects that can be proved. And the children who are killing people, that even at that young age is an act of power. Basing active powers on the unseen from the beginning of time has been well established. And I was fortunate enough to go on a trip to Greece. Jim McLeod was on this. And one of the interesting things that I saw were wonderful, beautiful statues of angels. And these statues were 4,000 years old. And coming from a Judeo-Christian background, who I'm also very broad-minded, my question was, this was before Christ. This was well before there was established amongst the society at that time one God, many gods. And so where did the angels come from? And I don't know if Jim was there at the time. One of the Greek people at the museum explained this to me, and that from the beginning of time, power in the minds of the people of those times was the power to fly. And that might address your Thunderbird question. They felt that if the spirit could fly as the birds fly, whoever could attain that power would be the greatest leader, the greatest power in essence. And so I think, as I started to say, the underlying basis for a lot of this is the question of power. Right or wrong, how is it used? And so the things that come through our mind that you can't explain, I think Black Hawk stated it eloquently about, I know things that I shouldn't know and I do not know where it comes from, or something to that effect. I think if all of us would relax for 5 minutes and take the mundane out of our mind, we all would have a lot different kinds of experiences. But a lot of us are afraid to say we have those experiences because then we will lose power. You know, you're either losing faith in the community of the status quo, or you're stepping over the line to the other side. And so I think the whole issue here is allowing power to come about however it is in our minds.
Would anyone like to respond to that? How about you, Rodney?
I think I'd pick up on a little bit of what you said, and also Tony too, in making reference to the sociological situations that we find ourselves in today. And you mentioned violence and a number of the other things. And it appears to me that when you have a society which is based on, I'm thinking primarily Western, the manipulation of things leads to the manipulation of people. And it goes on. And I think in the Western world, we seem to have, and we do it, of course, in the realm of politics, we do it in the realm of economics, you name it. Maybe you use the word power, control. And I think somewhere, and I think I see some evidences that maybe we are coming back around to a more holistic view of a different kind of a paradigm. I think there may be some shifting. I think we may be in the transition of that shift. I think even science is leading in that direction with quantum theory. So I think there's beginning to be some movement that we're not going to have this alienation, because I think this separation, this manipulation, that we move to the physical. We're so material and physical related in a very scientific, objectable, measurable world, that I think what we do is we relate that to people too, the way we live. And there is a mysterious end. Maybe mystery isn't the right word. Maybe we'll come up with another word that we're not so much afraid of. That is going to be, we can experience all these things. We can be objective and subjective at the same time. And maybe that produces a new world out there. And maybe at some point, we may be moving towards that new paradigm. I kind of see some evidences of that.
Yeah, I had a response to the last question about the writing on the walls and the Indians. I don't have a whole lot of background on that, but one thing I believe is, how discovery begins is by imagination and by vision. And maybe these Indians wanted to fly, and they didn't know how, so they just started drawing on the wall. I think that they, imagination has a lot to do with that, and maybe that has something to do with it.
Or maybe they did fly.
Maybe.
Yes.
I have to go, but I would just like to say, I think it all comes down to a lot of, each of us have our own egocentric or ethnocentric perspective. Where I can try to relate to this. I think perhaps, we're talking about looking at a different perspective. You have the spiritual and the physical, the science. Maybe if some of these Aztec people came back and they were sitting here, they think, boy, you guys are stupid people. You're using your minds to rationalize this, when it's really a spiritual thing. And maybe that's, the kind of experience you had, Dr. Fry, with the little people. You have to get away from that rationalization, because it's a different way. Maybe they're not even rationalizing. Maybe it's a completely different thing. That's why it's a mystery to us. Let's face it, every one of us are a weirdo to somebody else. And I think maybe a better word you can use in that bulletin, and that is phenomenon. Because to me that describes wonders. And sorry, I forgot your name, Jeannie?
Jeannie.
Yeah. You refer to like special as to mystery. When I think of phenomenon, I think of wondrous, wonderful, and maybe that's a better word to describe what we're talking about here today.
Thank you, that was a good point.
That was a very good point. Those words, wonderful, that says a lot about you as how you accept information. And that's wonderful. I'd like for you to consider just one thing that fits into what he brought up. And in terms of healing, when you're sick, when you're not feeling well, you get the doctor with the scientific background to deal with your physical needs. And that's it. It's a one-dimensional kind of relationship. Things are changing in that Indian health hospitals are now allowing medicine men to go into practice medicine along with a regular medical doctor. And what is happening is that people are recovering quicker. They don't need to stay as long. They need less medication as they leave. And I think that really speaks to the point, as we are human beings, we're vulnerable, and yes, our bodies do break down and we need some help. That prayer, that time to surrender to, I guess you could call it a higher power, but using the tools that the earth has given, perhaps burning some sage or some sweet grass, and using a symbol of flight, the eagle feather, to have a solemn moment to ask for that additional assistance to keep going. That, I think, is true healing, rather than a prescription full of antibiotics or whatever, and painkillers that will ultimately not take care of the problem. So in looking at all of this interesting phenomena, healing in this country is changing as well.
Isn't that going back to the holistic approach that you were talking about, Bob? You know, one of the things that I often think about, 10,000 years from now when there's a new civilization and they find Mount Rushmore, how, they won't have any concept of presidents, of course. They're going to assume it's some deity, hopefully. And I think along those lines and think, are we as mistaken in our explanations of ancient symbols and phenomena as probably they will be in ours? Does anyone else think along those lines? Yes.
I just wonder why to believe something it has to be logical. It seems like that's the way we are. If it's not logical, we can't believe it. And just maybe some people get feelings about, many religious people feel, well, my church, I believe in God because of the way I feel. Why can't more things be like that? Why does everything have to be so logical to believe it?
I'd just like to say a word in response to that. I think sometimes we have what's known in logic here as the excluded middle in some of these situations where either something is logical or it's illogical. And my sense, at least the spirit I understand these presentations being given in, is that we're dealing with something that I call maybe non-logical, but not necessarily illogical. And I don't know, I only know by reputation the gentleman who will be here Friday, but I suspect that he's going to throw some of the non-logical into the area of the illogical or irrational. And I think if that's the case, and am I making a Jean Dixon prediction here? I am, I think. And she was this tall. I would hope that would not be the situation. I think too often that in education we like those two categories. They're neat, tidy little boxes. This is rational and logical. This is illogical, irrational. If you're a sane, white, Anglo-Saxon, Celtic person like I am, you put things in the logical box and you learn those, and the things that are in the illogical box you don't learn, you don't pay attention to, and there's nothing in between those two.
Yes.
On that box thing, it's kind of interesting because when you come into something like this, the first thing you're struck with is that's a Coeur d'Alene legend, that was a Crow legend, everything's got its box, and people almost are built in to think that only those people in that area are privy to and can understand what's going on in it. And it was kind of interesting this morning when he brought out the fact that they change the names of places, they change other things, yet other people who would come in later would still experience the same thing. So it kind of wipes away this idea that you have to be part of this esoteric group or subgroup, or whatever you want to call it, a culture, to become privy to any of this. And of course, Dr. Devay's example cites a perfect example of that, what he went through. And I think it's just the limitation that some people will not let themselves go, quote, maybe beyond logic. If they let themselves go, they can enter into these areas.
Yes.
Back to the medicine man. You were saying that by using sweetgrass or sagebrush and burning in a feather for the anything you refer to, the first thing that came to my mind was psychological. Would that come back in, and this might be the wrong question to ask, but wouldn't that then bring the question, can the mind heal? Or is it actually, I don't know if this is in fact the right question to ask, but is it psychological as far as the Indians went in getting healed?
Yeah. I would say that that part, the spiritual side, works in tandem with the physical and the emotional, working completely together for total healing. And of course, there are things that people will never overcome, say a limp from a serious leg accident. But I think in healing and trying to get the bones healed up and proper diet, yes, the spiritual taps upon a person's will. And that's such a tiny word that just means so much as far as a human being is involved. But the spiritual taps into the will, which ties in with the physical, that would allow for recovery. And medicine men, or the traditional healers, and there are many healers out there, not just American Indians, there are people who practice the art of healing, that they have a hard time dealing with someone who does not have that will to get well. And if a person does have that will and wants that body to get functioning again as it used to, then there's a greater chance for recovery. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
The Crow word for, when asked the question of a Crow, Aqualia, one who doctors, they'll say ultimately that the patient has to have diagagic, which translates doing it with determination, sincerity, will. That's the key ingredient. In the context of a reciprocity, in order to receive something, something has to be given. That doesn't exclude, I think, and it doesn't, I would want to suggest it doesn't reduce it simply to psychological terms. I would agree with Jeannie that there's a duality here, maybe a multiplicity of levels at work, psychologically, or what we would call psychological, certainly at work. But again, to simply reduce it to psychological terms would be to impose a Western category on this experience that might do some damage to its full understanding. There was a very classic example of a fight that broke out in an Indian bar. Someone received 2 bullets near the heart. He was taken to the Indian Health Service hospital for treatment. He lost lots of blood. The physicians decided to wait before they would go in with surgery. The parents didn't want to wait. They called in the Akbalia. That evening, the one who doctored was there praying, and that was the most important thing he did, tapping into that spiritual level. But just before he left, that Akbalia left the powder of the powder of lightning root, a particular plant, in the wound as part of the healing. A little later, the nurses came in to change the blood-soaked bandages, and when they pulled back the sheaths, what they found were the 2 bullets laying right beside the boy. As the Akbalia said, they had come out the same way they had gone in. And after x-rays were taken, there was no bullets, and after he regained his health, he was allowed to go home. Now, the fellow was out unconscious this whole time. It wasn't a matter of willing it consciously, a healing. I mean, there was something going on physically that removed the bullets that is not simply psychological here. To account for that then in those sort of terms, I would want to elicit additional levels of explanation or understandings or simply descriptions and not having to explain away. But there's a lot of things going on here.
You know, I think we can see a lot of examples for that, and the one that comes to my mind is the situation with Norman Cousins, who basically healed himself. And the situation that Jeannie was talking about is that even in modern medicine, doctors will now tell you that the psychological state of mind which the patient is in has one heck of a lot to do with how well they're going to recover. And that, again, going back to that holistic concept between the spirit, mind, and body, once that is all somehow functioning together, interesting things happen that we have difficulty sometimes explaining in scientific and medical terms.
Remember Dr. Coleman talked about keeping a sense of humor? I think that when I heard that, I heard him say, enjoy life. There are a lot of interesting tidbits out there. Maybe you'll figure them out, maybe you won't, maybe you'll learn something. You'll sure have fun. And I loved his remark about the trailer houses. And I thought that was great. Medicine men in my tribe also do something for people who are healthy and for people who are happy. And it's called the happy dance. And it's to keep you happy, to keep you laughing. And it's a funny dance, and everybody hoots and hollers and laughs. But it is also, I think, a recognition of that life is good. You should be laughing to be a total human being. Not all the time, but definitely have that dimension of your personality that enjoys life. You can laugh at yourself. You can laugh with other people. And that ties in with what Dr. Coleman asked us to do as we approach this subject.
Are there any more questions from the audience? Any more comments? Now that you know that we're We don't either have to explain or ridicule. Does anyone have any experiences they wish to share with us, other than the small people? Okay, well, thank you very much for coming today. If our panel doesn't have anything else.
Well, I was just going to say that I thought that Rodney's account was interesting because he was the only brave person up here in this whole group that would recount something like that. And I didn't want that to go by without my saying that I've had some experiences too that I could share as well. I've had 2 or 3 encounters with ghosts that I'd be happy to go talk about at some length, but I'm not going to do it right now. But I would tell you that I wouldn't want Rodney to be the only one up here that doesn't admit to this. But I wanted to say one other thing here, if I may, because this topic, as I understand it, we're sort of going into the circle here in many places, but it's about mysterious places and events. And what I tend to do in my own life is to try to localize that a bit. I could talk about mysterious places in North Idaho, and there are a number of them. But I think more to the point here is that as I said earlier, I think young people need to realize that everything isn't known about their area, everything isn't in the encyclopedia, that there are fun things and interesting things for them to discover. And I think we have a real obligation to young people in this area to give them a sense of place, a sense of ownership here, that this is not just a place to build a freeway through. It has a life of its own, a spirit of its own. I think what Jeannie said about the waterfall at Post Falls, I think is very important. How many times have I driven by that place and never looked over there or even thought about that? If there was some way to do this, I think that maybe some of the attraction to violence that some of our young people have, there wouldn't be all that because they'd have something else that they could find more important. And as far as events are concerned, relating within families or communities stories that people have to tell about things that have happened to them, I think it's a very important part of the bonding of communities. And I think we'd all agree today in our time and place that communities have, well, I remember a time in Coeur d'Alene we didn't lock the doors. You certainly do now. And I know there's quite a bit of concern on campus here that we have lighting at night because of some things that have gone on. All of that is somehow being eroded by the technological sort of thing, I think, Tony, that you were striving at. And I don't know whether I could say it's the evil spirit of television or which demon it is here, but I think that those are some important things that I feel should be hopefully kept alive, kept going in this community. I feel that Native Americans in this area have a real strong appreciation of this. I'd like to think, being a Scot myself and knowing something about my own ancestry, that I have some appreciation of it too. But I do feel that sometimes that we are losing some of that, and for whatever reasons, it seems to be disappearing, and that concerns me.
Does anyone have any response to that? Anything they would like to add?
I would like to say an amen to that, but I kind of relate to what Jim's saying, because one of the things that when I go into an area, I grew up in South Georgia, and the land and the trees and the animals we used them, but they were part of us. And I look back, maybe I'm 200 or 300 years old, because I talked to Lawrence Aripa, and I talked to some people, and we somehow talked the same language, because we had such a reverence for living things, and even rocks and the sand, and somehow there was something very special about all of it.
Erna, do you want to comment on that?
Listening to Rodney and Jeannie talk about the Native American culture, one thing that popped into my head a couple minutes ago was the importance of the blending of cultures, and along with that, I guess, is that the more that you know, or the more that you reach out to people and learn more about the world maybe that they live in is just a better place for all of us if we can do that.
Well, I think that's a good way to wrap this session up. I don't know what better words we could use. The rest of the week is going to be exciting. As Tony said, the rest of the week we will have the speakers appear on the panel. Today, Dr. Coleman did have to catch a plane and wasn't able to join us, but I think our panel did an amazing job. So, thank you again.